Good morning to everyone to this webinar, free webinar. This is a webinar in the context of Data Stories project, a project founded by European Union in the context of Erasmus Plus program. I'm Gianluca Vagnarelli, the founder of iStrategies, one of the project partners, and I will introduce you to the topic of today's webinar, that is on big data for social change. So I'm going to share the presentation. So, big data storytelling for social change. This is the title of this webinar. And what will you learn in the next minutes? In the first part of the webinar, we will see how to use the power of data, big data, to inspire policy change, generate public debates, and mobilize public opinion around social and political issues. In the second part, we will see concrete examples of big data for social purposes. And at the end, you will find some external resources if you would go in depth into the topic. So this webinar aims to provide a comprehensive, not a comprehensive investigation of big data for social change, which would have taken a long time, but to give you an overview on the topic. So this is the plan, and we can move on with the first slide. Giving a definition of big data storytelling for social change. What does it mean, big data storytelling for social change? Basically, it's the ability to keep together data analysis, data storytelling, and critical knowledge with the aim to produce unconventional narratives. So you can see that in this case, in the case of big data storytelling for social change, we have a combination of technical skills like ICT technical skills like data analysis, and humanistic and socio-political skills, we could say, as data storytelling and critical knowledge, especially. That is a real key element in the context of big data storytelling for social change. With the aim to produce unconventional narrative. We will see what does it mean, unconventional narratives. But before jumping into in the core of the topic, I want to say something about the big data, because usually when we talk about big data, the dangers and the risks of it are more evocated than the opportunities. The risks, for example, of inequality because of the concentration of big data in a few private hands, or the risk of new form of control that could reduce the citizens' freedoms, or the risks of influencing the life of democracies. We can evocate in this regard the Cambridge Analytica case, or the risk of unethical, non-ethical use of big data. It is surely that these risks are real and connected to the big data, so these are real risks, but the big data also brings opportunities for improving our lives and societies. And this webinar will show the big data contribution to promoting social change. So in this way, the first element to underline, to highlight, is that for the first time in history, citizens and civil societies can access to a huge quantity of public data, the so-called open data, analyze and interpret them without the support of the public authorities. In short, through open data, citizens and civil societies can turn into their hands data that before could be managed only by the state. I give you an example of it that refers to the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can see in the slide. You surely remember that during the pandemic, many governments shared with the public opinions data about COVID-19, data about new infections, victims, and so on. So this was also the case of the Italian government. And to have an overview at the global level of the state of the art of the pandemic, it was also possible to visit the Johns Hopkins University website, more in details, the Coronavirus Research Center, in which it was open data about COVID-19 from around the world were shared and allowing you to compare the state of the art of the pandemic among different countries, okay? So thanks to this big data sharing, public opinions have been informed like never before about the evolution of the pandemic. And this is the point. Citizens and civil societies could also analyze data, giving them a different interpretation from the one that public authorities provided. And that happened in Italy, for example, where we had public debates about the effectiveness of the government strategies against COVID-19. And this debate was powered by the different readings, we could say, of the data shared by the government itself. So you can understand in this context how relevant are big data, more in details, open data, because if this pandemic had developed in the last century, none of this would have been possible, because it would have not been possible to download the Excel file from the government website, and consequently would not have been possible to interpret the data differently. So this is the element to put in evidence, even if risks about big data are present, and we evocated these risks. Beside these risks, we also have the opportunity to produce counter narratives of data, alternative epistemologies of data based on different ways of analyzing and interpreting them. So this is the first element to underline. The second element to underline is the role that big data storytelling can play in this process of promoting social change. This is because representing data using big data storytelling is not only another way to communicate data, to share it, but it is a way to generate something new that is able to produce a new understanding of data, a new meaning of data. And I want to explain this using another example. This is the famous John Snow's map showing cholera cases in London in 1854. John Snow was an English doctor and epidemiologist, considered the father of the modern epidemiology, also because he traced the source of a cholera outbreak in a Nassau in London in that period. So how did he manage to do this? Visualizing cholera data on a map. When he positioned the cases on the map that you can see here in the red circles, he realized that cholera did not spread uniformly, but clustered around fountains like here, okay, which were contaminated by feces. So thanks to this visual representation of data, he could understand the essential dynamic of cholera, demolishing the other explanation and strategies implemented until then by the government, and finally fighting the cholera epidemic more effectively. So what is the moral of this story? The moral is that big data visualization as well as big data storytelling is not only another way to share big data, because through data representation, we understand elements that otherwise we never noticed. In short, data representation does not only mean representing data differently, but discovering something new in data, a new meaning of data, a new sense of data. And if this was true at the time of Jon Snow, when society did not produce huge quantities of data, this is particularly true today under the so-called big data revolution, in which we are victims, we could say, of dataxication, a combination between data and intoxication. So to summarize this first part of the webinar, we could say that besides the risks we mentioned, big data also represent an opportunity to turn in our hands public data that in the past were only in the hands of public authorities. Second element is that in the era of dataxication, big data storytelling is a crucial skill because able not only to better represent data, to simplify it, to communicate it better, but big data storytelling is a crucial skill to reinterpret data, to create alternative readings of data, to develop alternative epistemologies of data. And big data storytelling for social change is precisely based on this attitude, which aims to criticize data, reinterpreting them. And I'm going to explain this concept of big data storytelling for social change through concrete cases, of it. The first one is not technically big data storytelling for social change example, but it is important to explain the role data storytelling can play in favoring social change. So this diagram is the famous description of the slave ship. It is probably the most powerful image used by social and political movements fighting to abolish the slave trade. The diagram was created in 1787 to illustrate the conditions in which enslaved Africans were transported to the America using ships. The diagram has quickly become an iconic image of the inhumanity of the slave trade. Indeed, was widely known, appearing in newspapers, pamphlets, books, even posters, and so on, becoming very effective in raising awareness about the evils of the slave trade. Indeed, the aim of this diagram was exactly to give the spectator an idea of the sufferings of the Africans. Indeed, looking at it, you can immediately understand that each slave that in the image, the slaves are represented using these black bodies into the ship. Each slave, you can immediately understand that each slave in the ship occupied a really tiny space, just 25 centimeters high. In addition, they were often chained together in pairs, making movements even more difficult. So because of the long distances involved and the ship full capacity, food and water were rationed and always in short supply or ran out completely. Consequently, due to these difficult conditions, diseases such as smallpox, scurvy, and dysentery spread enormously during the trip, and a lot of women and men died during it. So why this image is an interesting case to share in a context of webinar on big data storytelling for social change? Because for the first time, the author represented the data about the slave trade using visualization. The data were available even before, but they had never been illustrated, represented so effectively. The second element is that the diagrams gives an immediate impression of horror to all who see it, because it is a crude but simple engraving of how slaves could be in England legally packed into a slave ship. Consequently, the capacity to effectively represent data is a crucial element to favor the emerging civic values of data and promoting social change. But in the case of this particular image, so representation of the data about the slave trade, we also have interesting aesthetic codes of the image that, even if are referred to this specific image, they can be generalized to be replied also in other contexts. So the first element is the non-fiction. A description of the slave ship does not represent an abstract idea of slavery, but a real boat of slaves in Liverpool. So the power of this data representation consists in the fact that the people portrayed are real people, real men, women, and children. Okay. So the second element is the counter narrative through which that is spread thanks to this image. In its factual and raw description of slavery, this image dismantled the false narrative about slavery in which slaves' conditions were mitigated using idyllic representation of Africa. The third element is the empathy. The diagram is able to stimulate in the viewer a sense of empathy towards the slaves. Indeed, they are represented in passive state, depicted as helpless victims packed in tiny spaces, evocating a feeling of suffocation. And the last element is the capacity to evocate something that is familiar to the audience. This image is memorable because it's able to evocate something that is familiar because related to our culture and background. I mean the biblical image of Noah's Ark. The slave ship, it represents a kind of anti-Noah Ark, in which the vision of harmony turned into disorder, and love is substituted by greed and trust for fear. So it's the opposite of the Noah Ark. So all these aesthetic codes constitute a semiotic shock tactic that makes this image so impactful. Indeed, the image adopts the same and traditional style to design the abstract beauty of ships, but integrating in it, and this is the key element, those clean lines with a row of human bodies printed in black ink. And it is precisely this human side, this human element that is into the ship, represented into the ship, that makes a description of the slave ship a so powerful data representation. The second example is an example of properly big data storytelling for social change. More in detail is an example of critical cartography. Critical cartography can be defined as the mapping the unmapped, or a counter mapping, and also a theoretical critique of conventional mapping or conventional cartography. In short, is the idea that maps are not value-free or neutral, because maps reflect and perpetuate relations of power. The name of this second example is Mapping the Diversity. That is basically a website that can be also defined as an example of data feminism. Okay, so based on the Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein definition, we can define data feminism as the activity that offers strategies for data scientists seeking to learn how feminism can help them work toward justice, and for feminists who want to focus their efforts on the growing field of data science. But data feminism is also about much more than gender. It is about power, about who has it and who doesn't, and about how those differentials of power can be challenged and changed. I want to show you the web page of the Mapping Diversity. So this is the web page of the project, and how is written on this on the web page. Mapping Diversity is a platform for discovering key facts about diversity and representation in street names across Europe, and to spark a debate about who is missing from the urban spaces. And they analyze in this project around 150,000 streets across 30 major European cities are analyzed, cities located in 17 different countries. And scrolling the home page, you can see the data about each single city. For example, clicking on it, you can have the data related to each city. For example, in this case, the 1,500 streets and squares are analyzed in Chisinau, and around 500 of these streets and squares are dedicated to people. And the 92.5% of these 500 streets dedicated to people are dedicated to men, with only 35 streets or squares related to women. So you have this kind of data for all the city involved in the investigation. And you can also see who is honored by the streets, so what kind of people. And you also have the percentage of, for example, for each city, to compare the percentage of you have in these cities related to the women, the street named dedicated to women in all the European cities analyzed, and also the most popular women figures. They are mostly saints or religious figures, but also scientists like Marie Curie and so on. So in this case, in the case of mapping diversity, so in the case of mapping diversity, we have a different aesthetic code compared to the previous case we shared, in the sense that in this case, in the case of mapping diversity, only showing the data makes it clear that we surely have a problem. We surely have an underrepresentation of women in the street toponyms in Europe, and comparing the data among European cities, it is also immediately possible to understand the different level of inclusiveness regarding diversities among Europe. So we can say that in this case, through the critical cartography, we have a new social practice that conceptualizes data in the light of political activism. In this case, the objective of this political campaign, the social campaign, it is to make public opinions aware of the lack of an equal representation in the city names in Europe. And consequently, we can in this context, we can define big data for social change as the capacity to promote social change using the knowledge extracted taken from data sets to, on one side, criticize the reality, the fact that we have, in this case, an underrepresentation of groups in Europe, and on the other side, create unconventional narratives able to mobilize public opinion around causes. We mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, these were unconventional narrative. This is an example in the sense that through this different cartography, we can realize that something that the conventional narratives are not able to communicate. So the fact that we have an underrepresentation, not right representation of a minority of groups in Europe. So this is another example of big data storytelling for social change related to the capacity to create different alternative maps or cartographies. So to conclude this webinar, what's the key message we should retain from this webinar? The key message is that in the case of big data for social change, the crucial skills are not only, we could say, the technical skills, the ICT skills, but a crucial element is critical thinking. Critical thinking has the capacity to create alternative ways of seeing the world, has the capacity to create different narratives, a different point of view through which we can understand the world around us differently. So this is really, really important. So big data storytelling for social change is something in which we integrate ICT skills, technical skills, but also humanistic and social and political skills. So at the end, you can find some external resources. So the websites I mentioned, you can find there, but also the short books or articles or YouTube videos that I used for preparing this webinar. So thank you very much for your attention, and see you to the next webinar in the context of Data Stories project.